I published Canada's first paper, and it was more of a literature review. I read 100 papers on carbon leakage, but I published Canada's first paper on the impacts of carbon taxes and carbon pricing on something called carbon leakage. I did that because there was not a single economic paper written on the impact to Canada of carbon pricing relative to carbon leakage at that time. So what does that mean, carbon leakage? What it means is that IPCC and other international bodies have said that when we implement climate policies, we should be trying to avoid two things. One is energy poverty. Like, let's not introduce policies that make people poor. That seems pretty obvious, and yet we do know that some of the policies that we're creating are having an impact on affordability and poverty right here in Canada even. But there's one thing, let's not create energy poverty. The other one is, let's just not create incentives that we don't reduce emissions, we just move them somewhere else. And in that case, so that's carbon leakage. What it says is, let's put a carbon tax in Canada, but they don't put a carbon tax in the United States. So people say, great, well, I'll just move my business to the United States to avoid the tax. Then the real irony becomes, in our effort to make the planet better, to reduce global emissions, what we actually do is nothing for emissions. So we cause global emissions to stay the same or even go up. Meanwhile, we've lost the jobs in the economic development. So that's carbon leakage. And I was the first person to publish a paper on that and policy options. And I think it's been something that Canadian policymakers have just completely, or not completely, but not nearly adequately addressed. I'm going to give you an example of what I mean too, that Canadian aluminum, and there's a study that our group commissioned with Navius. I asked that to be done to help support some of the economic papers we published, and talked about Canadian aluminum. And Canadian aluminum is produced with hydroelectricity. And so it's a very low emissions. So only 2 tons of CO2 created in the production of 1 ton of Canadian aluminum. That number in America is 11 tons because coal-fired electricity, so on and so forth. So 5 times the amount of CO2 to make a ton of aluminum in America. Well, if you put a carbon tax in Canada and result that that ton of aluminum gets produced in the United States instead to avoid the carbon tax, you just made emissions increase by 500%. We should be having policies in Canada that say, no, just a second. We are going to give you an incentive to produce your aluminum in Canada because every ton produced here instead of the United States reduces global emissions by 500%. A lot of the policy people are going, well, no, but just a second. If you produce an extra ton of aluminum here, there'll be 2 extra tons of CO2. We don't want Canada to have extra 2 tons of CO2. Well, just a second, but we just reduced 11 in America. We should be doing everything we can to produce as much aluminum here as possible because we're the world's best at aluminum. Well, this turns out to be true about a lot of things.